So on my first clinical rotation, my first patient in front of both my peers and professors, I failed spectacularly. It was a horrible experience, and I wanted to teach you guys kind of what I learned through that experience and some takeaways you can have for when you're going into your first clinical. So what happened was our school puts on a clinic that we do in the school. We have a pro bono clinic that we run, and at the end of your first year of school at George Fox, we have a clinical experience called May Term, where in the May of that first year, you go in with groups of 4 to 5 students with 1 or maybe 2 CIs that are either a professor or a local physical therapist in the area, and you go and treat patients for free in the clinic, and you do this for 6 weeks. And usually how the process looks like is you get there at 8 a.m., you have anywhere from 6 to 8 patients for the day, and it's split among your 4 to 5 team group members. So at the beginning of the May term, each group got to decide whether you wanted to teach one at a time. So basically, you select one person, they're going to run the whole patient by themselves, or you split it up as a group. So one person does the subjective, one person does the objective, one person does the interventions. So each group had to kind of experiment and see what worked for them. For my group personally, we thought it would be better if each person took their own patient one at a time. And so that's what we did, and we decided to do that on the first day already. So on the first day of clinical experiences, I was the last person in my group to go at the end of the day with my first patient. So my other teammates went in front of me, and everyone's pretty nervous because this is your first time practicing as a clinician. You do have a lot of safety nets with your other peers as well as your professors in the room, but it is pretty nerve-wracking because basically you've been taught all the theory. That's what the first year is about. It's all the theory, the anatomy, the neuroanatomy, basic thorax, but you haven't really learned yet how to do differential diagnosis. You haven't really had much experience like teaching patients in this more professional way. A lot of us have been either like personal trainers or physical therapy technicians, but now we're the ones calling the shots for the first time. It's a big step up, and we were really nervous. And I know for me personally, I made the mistake of over-preparing a lot for each patient. So I literally sat down like the night before. We could pull up the chart of the patients we would see the next day. Now sit there for hours, like prepping for each patient, prepping for each possibility, really over-preparing, making sure I got everything down. The problem with doing that is that you end up siloing yourself into a specific treatment pattern before ever seeing the patient. And that's something you don't want to do. Right? Patients almost never present how they appear in their chart. And that's a very first important step to take away from this is you don't want to over prepare for a patient. Okay? You want to be flexible. You want to be able to see things on the fly because sometimes a patient comes in and it's something completely different than what's showing on their chart. All right? Never trust the chart. That's one of the first lessons I learned, and I learned that the hard way with my first patient. So to set the scene, it's the end of the first day. All my group members had gone. It was my turn. And I was really, really nervous. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to run into. The patient we had, all I knew was he was going to have some sort of abdominal pain. I was like, all right, we'll see what goes on. So the patient comes in. He's pretty nervous as well. He's not a very open guy. He doesn't talk a lot. So it was hard for us to build kind of any rapport. And with this kind of May term experience for our first clinical, it's really difficult to build rapport because your patient's in a situation where they're also a little bit uncomfortable because you're basically in a treatment room with like you have 4 or 5 people watching you, and within that room there's like 5 other groups because we're basically split up into 2 or 3 rooms in the building between all 40 students in the cohort and their patients. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of people, and this guy clearly wasn't maybe the best fit for May term because he was really nervous. He seemed like he didn't really want to share what was going on. He didn't like all the loud activities and everyone watching him. And so he didn't really give us a lot of information to go off of, but he came down, he sat down, he's like, hey, like I have pain like in my stomach region. I've had a history of hernias and it's hurting again while I'm working, and I'm afraid that I have like another hernia happening. And so for me, I was like, all right, I don't know a ton about like how to treat hernias yet. We're still early in our first year. Again, I haven't had a lot of clinical experience. And what happens is, as a first-year student, you latch on pretty heavily to any kind of clinical tidbits or information because you're basically, again, you're learning all theory that first year. And so when you get a practical clinical piece of knowledge from a professor, you really like latch onto it and be like, I need to do it this way. And so one of the things that I had latched onto was when you check a patient for hernias, you want to be able to rule out if it's an adductor strain in the groin region versus an actual hernia happening in the abdominal region. Because a lot of times those two can get mixed up. And this guy mentioned that he had pain every time he was twisting and turning. And so I was wanting to make sure that it wasn't an adductor groin strain and not a hernia showing up. And so what our professor had showed us was that you have the patient laying in supine on their back, they have their knee resting against you with their legs in hook lying, and you basically palpate down their adductors and you have them cover up their private area. You adduct down, you palpate, you feel, and you basically ask them if there's any pain there, and you can also have them resist against you and see if that causes any pain. And so that was my plan. I was going to go through that flow where I roll out the adductor strain, and then I also palpate the abdominal area and see if there is any pain for the hernia. And when he had sat down and just pointed at, like, oh, I have pain here, he had a bit of a larger pannus, and so it was hard to see exactly where he was pointing. So I had him laying on his back, and he was pretty nervous. I hadn't built up good rapport. I did ask permission to touch him, but he obviously wasn't very comfortable because he was super, super guarded. And basically, I was like trying to palpate down his adductors. He was just super tense and guarded. I basically couldn't get any viable information from that palpation because he was so just guarded. And basically, I palpated all the way down. I was trying to make small talk. It was super awkward. All my classmates were just watching me. My professor was just sitting there just staring at me. And I was like, okay, no pain there? And he was like, no. And then I was like, can you point again to where your pain is? And then he pointed above the inguinal line. I was like, it's not even close to being in the adductor region. I hadn't thought to ask, because he has a larger pannus, that he should lay down and tell me again where the pain is, because I couldn't tell when he was seated where that pain was referring to. So basically, I'd done this super awkward, just palpating his adductors, having him cover himself up in front of everybody. He was super guarded. He was super embarrassed. I was embarrassed. And basically, I just wasted time palpating him when I didn't need to there. And then I did palpate the region where he had the pain, and that did reproduce his pain. And then I was able to give him some interventions for managing his intra-abdominal pressure while doing work-related activities, and we sent him away. And I think the rest of my session went okay, but it was just such a horrible start. I never got the rapport building there. I saw him one other time later in May term, and it was still super awkward. So I pretty much just botched that patient, and I was really embarrassed, and it really brought me down because that was my first patient that I've treated in my clinicals, basically, and it went horrible. I know I eventually figured out what was happening, so that was good, but I really felt like I failed in a lot of ways. And of course, all your classmates are kind of making fun of you, like, oh, you're palpating groins, bro, what are you doing? So it was a pretty rough first experience, and I think two big things to take away from is, first of all, don't over-prepare with your charts and let that silo you into a certain funneling treatment. And two, be careful when you're latching on to information that professors gave you in your first year, because I applied basically properly what I thought I needed to do, but I wasn't doing that within the proper context. And that's the problem, is you take random clinical bits of information, but you're not applying them in the moment with the context needed for the patient in front of you. And again, because I over-prepared in advance, I wasn't seeing what was happening with the patient in front of me, and so I lost that context, and I started just doing random objective tests. And this is what's really common for a lot of us first years in our first clinical, is we're just doing a ton of objective testing all over the place, measuring every little thing, palpating everything, because we want to make sure we don't miss something. And we end up dragging out the first evaluation so long, and we basically don't have any time for interventions or education because we're spending all our time just figuring out what's going on. And it's fair that you got to go through that learning experience in order to start building your habits of figuring that out. But it is tough to learn that the hard way like I did. So I hope that this video helped you guys a little bit and that you could take something away from it and better prepare for your practicals once you go into your clinical experience. Thank you for your time.